Good morning to everybody. We are right now at the lecture number 10, and today the topics is related to the photo interpretation basics. All right. Remote sensing stands as the scientific discipline that deals with the acquisition, processing, and interpretation of measures relating to physical phenomena affecting surfaces, in particular the Earth's surfaces, without coming into contact with them through the study of interaction of electromagnetic radiation with the surfaces themselves to arrive at an image of reality. This image will then be broken down into themes, that is, areas of similar behavior characteristics. The process of recognizing the themes is based on information that can be extracted from the images themselves and connected to color or spectral characteristics of shape, texture, or others of the object represented in them. The final thematic map derives from a complex of procedures, partly automatic and partly with direct intervention by the application domain expert. It should be noted that, however, even the most complex and sophisticated classification algorithms need an intervention strategy that takes into account the geographical and thematic context of the environment described in the image of the observed territory. So, in this introduction, what is very important here, and what I mentioned since from the first lecture, is that now we have acquired the data on board of the sensor of the satellite, and now after transmitting that to to the ground station, we need from this data to extract information. So this is the general paradigm we are facing right now, and so we are starting to fully understand which are the characteristics of the images that allows us to possibly extract information from data. So, looking in depth in a remotely sensed image, an image is the description of a phenomena or process, usually by means of a two-dimensional representation of data relating to the phenomena or processing being investigated. The world of images is very vast, of course, and includes a multiplicity of forms with which they can be represented. Some describe the visible and other the invisible, or what our eye is not able to catch. Some are real and others abstract. Pictures of faces and landscapes, drawings of children, paintings of painters are images. Pure images are those that graphically represent mathematical functions, those of the galaxies obtained through radio telescopes, those of the Earth taken by artificial satellites. As the pages of a book contain sequences of characters, elementary parts belonging to an alphabet organized in a language according to grammatical and syntactic structures, the image can be considered as a set of elementary parts with structured connections that are called forms, organized in the plane so as to form structures or sequences of shades of gray or brightness levels that make up the information grains. In general, in remote sensing, a monochromatic image is a two-dimensional function that associates the representation of an observed scene with a set of data relating to the interactions of electromagnetic radiation with the physical surfaces of the scene itself. In order to be able to read the images, it is necessary to know how they were generated, their characteristics, and the processing techniques that could enable the necessary interpretative key for the qualitative and quantitative extraction of the information contained therein. In the case of optical electronic recording devices, This physical recording surface does not exist, but its function is performed through the coupling between the sensitive area of the detector and a recording system of the electrical signal that is obtained in exit. Such devices, which are capable of making images, can be considered as a black box system that operates on an input signal, that is a radiant flux, of course, a radiance, to produce an output signal that is a number, as we all know, a digital number. It is completely characterized once its transfer function is known. So when we know the function, and we know that because we approached that in a previous lecture, we know how the sensor is sampling the radiance value that is entering to the sensor into a digital number that is the output of the acquisition. The sensor, as we all know, sequentially explores the Earth's surface, acquiring at regular intervals the radiation from the objects placed in its field of observation, the field of view. The cadence with which the sensor explores tile by tile as a mosaic the terrestrial surface through the sampling process helps to define the spatial resolution of the same. In other words, during each of these elementary sampling operations, the system measures the amount of radiation, for example, the number of photons, which, coming from a portion of the ground, affect its sensitive part on the basis of the instrumental specification used. These values of radiance are converted inside the optical electronic device into numerical values, starting from which the numerical or digital image, card by card or cell by cell, is constructed by means of an ordered recomposition of the elementary path called pixels. That is a sort of an acronym that stands for picture element. I'm sorry. Let's go through the image matrix. An image can be mathematically described as a function where this function L is a function of x and y, lambda and t, where there are two spatial variables, x and y, which represent the geographical coordinates, and of two parameters, lambda and t, which represent the wavelength, or spectral interval, or spectral bands, and the time, or time interval, in which the information is acquired. The L value assumed by the image function at a coordinate point x, y is called brightness or gray level. Whether the position variables x and y can take only a limited number of values within a certain range. And this range, of course, is ranging between 0 and capital X and 0 and capital Y. That means that these values comprised in these two ranges are something that is related to the field of view of the sensor and to, depending on the heights of the orbits in which the satellite is orbiting and is carrying on the acquisition, is related to the surface, to the transversal dimension of the image of the surface that is acquired by the sensor itself. And if the brightness value L can take only a finite number of levels in a certain range that is ranging between 0, theoretically, and the maximum brightness value. Then there is a digital image. When we are facing a digital image, this L max, in this case, is equal to 255. That stands for a radiometric resolution of 8 bits. But of course, the L max is the same value that is representing the radiometric resolution of that image. A digital or numeric image is therefore a two-dimensional function which is defined by sampling according to a regular grid model that represents the minimum element, the geometric resolution of the image, and the values it can assume belong to a defined range of positive integers, that is of course the radiometric resolution. It is therefore a set of discrete elements organized by rows and columns, and that is a matrix. Each of these elements, called pixels, but in our case I prefer to call that cells, is associated with a positive integer that represents the average measured radiance. For example, the amount of radiation that coming from a certain portion of the screen observed in a certain band of the electromagnetic spectrum affects the detector, or more generally, the average value of the measured quantity on a small area or elementary resolution cell. The cell is therefore the elementary tile that composes digital images. I'm sorry. Each cell is thus characterized by three different values, I, J, and L, where I and J are the row and column indices, respectively, which identify the position of the cell within the digital image, and L, which is the number, positive integer, related to the measured radiance value, and we saw that in the following figures. The row index I represents the y coordinates, while the column index j represents the x coordinate of the scene space. So we all know from since from the first lab that the origin of the digital image is conventionally placed at the top left, as for the matrices, and the y-coordinate that has the opposite direction with respect to the vector representation systems, which use the Cartesian plane as a reference. So that means that this is the representation of a digital image. I mean, it's still in Italian, but don't worry. This is the entire image. This is a case of a satellite acquisition. And you see here we have a small view done by 5 by 5 cells, or pixel in that case, and these are the values of digital number. So we already know that talking about x and y and j and the I and j, they represent two different geometrical reference systems. The I and j are the references of the matrix, while x and y are the projection, the geographical or cartographic projection of this matrix over a representation plane, while the values of digital number are represented by positive integers. I'm sorry. Let's go on. The numerical value cell associated with each pixel are not directly visible as they are numbers, but can be easily translated into gray levels or light intensity through a subsequent digital analog converter to be viewed on the screen. And this is the function of our screen, of our PC or of our TV. In the Anglo-Saxon literature, they are indicated with a whole series of terms such as pixel value with PV, BV that stands for brightness value, GV that stands for gray level, DC that stands for digital count, and what we are using in this course, that is DN, that stands for digital number. So we are using this term, this notation DN in I and J. So this is the notation that we are using in order to indicate a cell value in row I and column J in the K generic band, spectral band. Being the element of representation, the concept of cell brings with it the concept of resolution. Indeed, of the different types of spatial, spectral, radiometric and temporal resolution specific to the systems used in the acquisition. The spatial or geometric resolution accounts for the level of details that are recognizable on the ground. The radiometric resolution is linked to the number of levels with which the signal is quantized in the analog to digital conversion, while the spectral resolution indicates the width and or the number of the spectral bands used, while the temporal resolution is the frequency with which the sensor passes over the same area. And these are the general concepts, the four different general concepts of resolution that we already know. The different resolutions then are all interconnected, as we all know, and in competition with each other and constitute the elements that characterize a given mission. So, right now, we are analyzing the physical contents of the image, and of course, having a particular problem to face with remote sensing, of course, we need to choose the acquisition that give us the best possible resolution we can approach for that particular issue, that particular problems to face. To fully characterize the performance of the acquisition systems in terms of spatial resolution, it is necessary, as we know, to refer to the concept of MTF introduced in the previous chapter. However, since the most acquisition systems, the size of the detector is one of the main factors that determine the spatial resolution, for simplicity, the GFOV, that is another way to call what we mentioned as AFOV, that is the effective field, instantaneous field of view. Here is the ground instantaneous field of view. That means the AFOV projected on the ground surface. So this GFOV is used to indicate the spatial resolution associated with the cells of an image. So in order to fully determine the geometric resolution, we are associating to each cell of the image that has the same dimension for every single cell of the image, we associate that with the information of the GFOV, that is the effective instantaneous field of view reprojected cartographically on the ground. So the GFOV could be represented, as we know, by this ratio, and PL is the linear dimension of the detector, and as we know, capital H is the sensor height, and F the focal length of the optical system. In the case of thematic mapper, for example, to indicate the nominal size of the ground resolution cell associated with the cell itself, we can solve this ratio And for example, TM is the sensor that was mounted on board on Landsat 5 platform. Landsat 6 is missing because they lost in space all the platform. But you see that the linear dimension of the detector of the TM sensor is 0.097 millimeters. The orbital height is more or less 700 kilometers, while the focal length of the sensor is as long as more than 2 meters, you see. So on board of the satellites, they have a telescope that is more than 2 meters long. And that ratio, you see, is giving as a result more or less 30 meters. That is the resolution on the ground of these images. That means that the GFOV of TM is around 30 meters. Radiometric resolution is the other important element. It also derives from the analog-digital conversion process of the electrical signal obtained at the output of the detector, as well as from its sensitivity. The grider is the number of discrete values used to represent the amplitude of the signal. The grider, the ability to distinguish, that is the radiometric resolution, between the different radiance values of the scene, which is instead a continuous type. In general, as far as digital data are concerned, a finite number queue of bits is used to binary measurements of continuous quantities. The L number of possible gray level intensity values, or DN, digital number index numbers, is given by this simple relationship. Where, of course, the gray levels Dn can take all integer values in this range from 0 to the number of bits that we are using for the sampling. The larger the Q, so the number of bits that we are using for digital converts the analog signal that is coming from the ground, the better the digital data can approximate, as we know, the original observations, and the higher the so-called radiometric resolution of the sensor. Often, in remote sensing, the radiation collected by the recording system is broken down through a system of prisms or diffraction grids into its different spectral components, each of which is the specific detector, allowing multiple measurements to be taken simultaneously in different spectral bands. This characteristic is linked to the concept of spectral resolution. There are therefore multiple images of the same scene observed, one for each spectral band. Their whole is called the multispectral image. The multispectral image is therefore a multidimensional numerical matrix, each of which describes the scene observed in the relevant spectral band. The generic element, for example the pixel of coordinates I, j, is no longer made up of a single radiometric measurement dn, but, and this is very important, it is written of course in bold, can be considered as a vector of measurements of as many components as the spectral bands of the multispectral image. So one of the great advantages, as we mentioned in the first lecture, is the fact that these sensors are able to acquire multispectral images. So that means that we don't have only one single measurement, one single dn, but as written here, we have a vector of measurement for every single cell. Is just to have a sort of explanation of that, is that of having different images piled up one over the other, because the, the reference system is the same, And so when we are measuring a single cell, in reality we are measuring a vector of measurements, one single digital number for one single band, spectral band. It's important, I'm sorry, and before starting these topics here, I'm just checking if we are recording everything. So let me check. Yes, we are more or less half an hour. So when we are talking about these things here, the fact that we can register multispectral images, we need to go through something that is very important, that is the data recording formats. So digital images are organized in a series of files, each of which is made up of a succession of records. The real images constitute only a part, even if the main one, of the data that are acquired and distributed. They are normally accompanied by other information, in turn collected in other specific files, such as the initial file, that is the volume directory file, describing the entire volume of data, followed by the actual data in which each image file, that is called the imagery file, is preceded by a header file, leader file, and followed by a trailer file, which contain additional information regarding, for example, the identification and the status of the sensor, the platform arrangement, the ephemeris, etc. So that means that when an image is acquired and then transferred to the ground station over the Earth's surface, we don't have only simply, as we all know from, from the different labs, we had together, we don't have only the image matrix, but we have also, for example, the header file, we have the metadata file that is describing the data itself, but we have also other ancillary files that are incorporating all the different information we need in order to fully describe the imagery file. There are three main formats for recording image data, stating that we are facing multispectral acquisition. That means many different image files, one for every single spectral bands acquired by the sensor. And these three different main formats for recording this image data are depending on whether sorting by band, row, or pixel prevails. I'm sorry. So, the first one is what is called band sequential, BSQ, and we have approved of that, as you know, in Envy software itself. In this format, the digital numbers of each band are arranged one after the other until all the cells of the bands are completed. In the same files are therefore contained all the cells of a spectral band, and to each record of the file corresponds a scan line of the recording system, and to each band corresponds a file. The BSQ format allows a well-structured organization of the data, even if the extraction of multiple sub-images is not easy. It is, however, the most common format in the distribution of satellite data. Allow me to go to the next slide where we have this figure here. And so let's go through the four different images, starting with the left one. So we are acquiring, I'm sorry, it's still in Italian. We need to acquire three, we are using a sensor that is acquiring, for example, three different bands, band 1, band 2, and band 3. And so, I'm sorry, when we are acquiring these three bands, we can register these three bands I'm sorry, in these three different formats. And so we mentioned the first format, that is the BSQ, that stands for band sequential. So we register in the first position the first band, the first image that is representing the first band, then all the images that is representing the second band, and third, we are registering the third band. So this is the band sequential. Let's go back. I'm sorry, here. So when we are introducing, I'm sorry, today is hard for my voice. The second format is what is called BIL, that stands for band interleaved by line. In this format, the digital numbers are organized by line instead of by band. After the digital numbers of line 1 of the first band, the digital numbers of line 1 of the second band, followed by the other bands till to the completion of all the bands. The image data are all contained in a single file, and the BIL format facilitates the extraction of multispectral sub-images. So let's check the figure. You see, this is the BIL format, the band interleaved by line format. You see, I have in the first line of the file, the first line of the first band. In the second line of the output file, I have the first line of the second band. And in the third line of the output file, I have the first line of the third band. When in the fourth line of the output file, I have the second line of the first band, and so till to the end of all the three bands. At the last position, in the last line of the output file, I will have the last line of the last band of the acquisition, and till here, that is called with the acronym EOF, that stands for end of file. So let's go back. Now we have the last possible format of multispectral recording, that is called BIP, that stands for band interleaved by pixel. In this format, the digital number, rather than having an alternation for lines, follow an alternation for cells, so that after the cell of the line 1 in the band 1 follows the cell 1 of the line 1 of the band 2, and so on. This format, which was the first adopted, is currently hardly used for satellite data anymore. So we are in the right part of the figures. Here I have this BIP, band interleaved by pixel format. So that means that in the first cell of the output image I have the first cell of the first band, in the second cell I have the first band of the second band, and in the third cell I have the first cell of the third band. In the fourth cell I have the second cell of the first band, and so on. And the end of file I will have the last cell of the last band of the acquisition. This one, because we are starting from the upper left position of the image. All right, let's go through the photo interpretation process then. I'm sorry. The following list shows and compares some of the main characteristics of the two types of the interpretation processes that we will face from now on. The specific, qualitative, based on the human analysis, and the typical, quantitative one, based on the automatic machine processes. So when we are dealing with photo interpretation that is typical of a human analyst, we are taking care of the facts that this process is completely made by the expert, that has a very high level decision process, because we are using our brain, of course. It's a limited multispectral analysis because, for example, on the screen we can see altogether only three different bands in the possible multispectral acquisition because we are using an RGB system. There's a limitation, as we all know, as we introduce in the lecture number 7, we have a limitation of the distinction of gray levels, for example 16, or color tones. There's a ease to use the off-space information, so we can catch very easily, simply looking at the images, the shape, the size and the texture of the different features that we are just observing and they are contained in the image, works on a small scale compared to the cell dimensions. So I mean, small scale, you remember, in geomatics is a view that is representing very small the object. I'm sorry, and just observing with our eyes as the human photointerpretation process, we are working in a very small scale. So when, for example, we are looking at large scale, for example, what is appearing in the MV software in the zoom windows, our eye is not really capable to detect all the different details. So, it works only on small scale. We have a very low accuracy in calculating areas, of course. We cannot calculate directly the areas, simply observing and photointerpreting the data. And this photointerpretation process is subjective. That means that, every single individuals can interpret it in different ways the same process on the same object. Is on the other hand very concrete because it's based on what we can catch and is based also on our experience, but it's very qualitative. So that means that it's not performing any measurement on that, but it's based on the comparative method that we are doing on what we already know and what is our experience. Well, when we are instead dealing with automatic interpretation, what is we can do with our computer and with our software and with the different algorithms, we can say that we have a very limited interaction request. So the computer or the software is able to perform most of the activities by itself. There's a very low-level decision process because computers and software are stupid. So in order to give them the intelligence, we need to work on that because otherwise the level of the decision process that they are using is very low. Of course, there's not a brain under these processes. There's a possibility using software to approach a real multispectral analysis because there's not the limitation of the RGB, for example, visualization. There's the ability to quantitatively analyze all the possible level of grays. So, for example, for 8-bit acquisition, the full 256 levels, or all the possible minions of colors that we can generate from the RGB synthesis. There's a limitation at the moment in techniques that use spatial information, but we will see that using, for example, artificial intelligence algorithms, we can in some way overcome this limitation. This process, the automatic interpretation, operates at a single cell level, so differently from what is doing the human interpreter that is observing at a very small scale. Here we can work with the vectors of measurements, as we mentioned before, at a single cell level. I'm sorry, and we can have a precise assessment of areas in terms, for example, of measurements of surfaces, and this process is absolutely objective. If we are performing this process millions of times, the results will be always the same. It's abstract, so it's not subjective, but is something that could be measured, and could be measured because it's very quantitative. So we have some functions that are able to measure data, or the data on the way in which the data are arranged together. So there are two different, very different processes, and during the course, as you know, we are using both the approaches, because I mean sometimes we need, for example, for the extraction of region of interest, we need a human photo interpretation, while, for example, as we will see in the next lectures, for the classification processes, we are using automatic interpretation, because I mean it's working better than the human photo interpretation. The process of analysis and visual interpretation of the images is highly dependent on the ability of the human analyst to make generalizations, that is, to pass from the details of a single observation to an abstract model. This generalization process is a complex analogical process. To be able to identify an object on an image, it is necessary to cope on a knowledge built up over time through the experience of analyzing many and various images. The characteristics of shape, size, color, texture, and structure are automatically associated with a certain model. So, mental processes allow an abstraction of these key types of known objects, so that this information can be applied to the recognition of new objects. So that means that, as we mentioned in the lecture number 7, what is very important for the human observer is that we can gain a visual experience, especially when observing satellite images, and associating the concept that we are going to describe. We can, day by day and by experience, we can apply these processes in order to better recognize objects, and also to generalize this knowledge to other objects that we have never seen before. For example, when flying over a certain area by plane, it's possible to recognize a series of landscape elements, such as a lake, a mountain, that is based on the logical process of abstraction of the typical characteristics of the lake, of the mountain, that human beings acquire during times. Reproducing these generalization processes that led to recognitions means entering the domain of artificial intelligence, where a preliminary quantitative and quantitative processing phase of image data is necessary. I'm sorry, so what does it mean, these elements? That we can recognize, for example, a lake as a thing that, if observed from above, is characterized by something that is similar to water, so a surface that is absorbing the energy the electromagnetic energy that is coming from the sun, while a mountain has a particular shape, sometimes is covered by vegetation, sometimes by rocks, and so on. And so, giving this primary information, for example, to an artificial intelligence algorithm, we can try to train this algorithm, as our brain is doing with us, to recognize different features on the ground. Let's go to the image interpretation keys. In this process of interpretation, the expert is based on the analysis of some characteristics parameters of the image, such as contrast, textures, shape, etc. Among these parameters, those that must be highlighted are chosen according to the particular problems to be solved and the particular field of application, such as territorial planning, for example, the study of agricultural crops, forest, or geomorphology, and so on. So, it may be useful to briefly summarize here the key parameters that trigger the psychovisual mechanism of the photointerpreter in extracting information from the visual analysis of the image. And trust me, for us it's very important to introduce these key parameters because some of them are very trivial for us. I mean, they are very used to work inconsciously using these parameters. But there are others that we need to think about in order to be trained to better recognize objects on our images. So let's start. The first one, that maybe is one of the most important, I'm sorry, is what we can represent as a shape. What is a shape? The shape is simply given by the geometric outline, that is the contour of an object. Of course, these key parameters are devoted to images. Then, of course, when we are talking about geometric outline or contour of an object, I'm referring to an object that is present over an image. It is the most common and most important element for identifying an object. Often, the simple outline contains such a surprising amount of information about the nature and function of an object, so that without any other additional information, the photointerpreter is able to recognize whether an object is artificial or natural, for example. You remember that, for example, when we are talking about cover classes, we can easily distinguish, for example, crops, so culture, by forest, because I mean culture has a very straight contours, while, for example, forest have very irregular contours. So you see that the shape is very important in order to simply recognize the different features that are present on the ground. Another very important things that we should use in order to recognize the object is the dimension. The size is generally referred to the area of an object, but can also indicate the simple linear size, such as the length of an airport runway, for example. Although not consciously, as soon as looking at an image, the brain-eye system immediately assigns a scale. This occurs not in a quantitative sense, of course, because we have not this ability, but simply on the basis of the size of known objects, an house, a lake, a nation, for example, in proportion to the size of other elements of the whole image. Of particular interest is the relationship of size between different objects of the same kind. For example, two lakes, two buildings, for example, two airplanes or something like that. I'm sorry again. So we need to face this dimension, and this assessment of the size of the object is not something that we are usually doing. So I mean, please, as we are already used during the labs, pay attention to the size of the objects, because this is a very clear indication of what this object could be. So in order to extract the information, for example, what an object is, of course the size is very important. Tone and color. The tone corresponds to the intensity level of a monochromatic image, the panchromatic image, the gray tones, or the combination of the intensity level of a multispectral, that is a color image. So color is the primary characteristic of most natural elements present on the Earth's surface, while it may be less decisive for artificial elements. For panchromatic images, the photointerpreter must develop the ability to refer to gray tones, to possible colors, or possible response intensities at different wavelengths, taking into account climatic, seasonal, and lighting conditions. This is an area where the potential of the computer is larger than the human expert, of course, and is the basis of the automatic classification techniques of multispectral images, like we will see in the last lecture of this course. So I mean, you know that, of course, for example, colors are very important, but of course, in order not to be to have some errors of interpretation, of course, for our is very crucial, and this is important to check how we realize the color image. So I mean, it's very important to know in advance in the RGB system which band we have associated to the different to the three different channel for the visualization. Otherwise, we can make some error of interpretation, especially for colors, of course. Texture. What is a texture? A texture describes the presence of spatial variations or of brightness within an element. It is that characteristics which determines the smooth or wrinkled appearance of a certain surface. For example, at certain wavelengths, a forest and a water body have the same average intensity of gray levels, but the uniform texture of a water body and the varied texture of the crown of trees allow for easy identification. So you see, texture is something that, together with the contour and the color, it's make us easier to understand what is the representation. For example, with the example that is given here, distinguish between something that is reflecting, for example, in the red band in a very similar way, like water and forest. But I mean, the texture allows us to understand that this is a surface of vegetation and the other one is a surface of water. Then the model or structure. The model of structure can be defined as the spatial arrangement of the shapes of objects that have a well-defined geometric characteristics and periodicity. Consider, for example, the regular arrangement of trees in a poplar grove compared to the apparently irregular arrangement of trees in a wood. For the various scale patterns, there are four main control environments, such as a field of corn, and in the same way for natural elements, such as an hydrographic network. Recognizing a model includes a large cultural contribution, and extracting information from a particular model requires some form or a priori knowledge. And this certainly applies to the machine, but also to man. So, for example, just giving another example that is very easy, for example, for people that is coming from this region, for Piedmont, when we are approaching vineyards, for example, in vineyards you can easily catch a model because the vegetation is arranged in lines, especially in the hilly part of the southern part of the region of Piemonte. And so when you have this repetition of lines, of vegetation lines on the hills that usually are following the high contour lines of a map, and when you have these lines, you are quite sure that you are facing vineyards, because I mean, this is derived by the model, so the way in which this this spatial texture is arranged over a larger space. Then we have, of course, also the shadow, that are very important, for example, as we mentioned in the labs, for example, for modeling the Rayleigh scattering, the selective scattering, because we are using the dark subtraction model, So the shadows are usually considered a disturbing element for the interpreter, since they make it difficult to observe objects in particular in very dark conditions. However, as we know, the shadow of an object through the information of its profile can be decisive for its recognition. For example, for visual interpretation, the long shadows of a satellite image acquired in winter highlight the morphology of an area much better than a summer shot, of course, and this is depending on the height of the sun over the horizon. And of course, if it's very low on the horizon, we will have larger and longer shadows, and that could allow some particular extraction of information. So, for example, in this case, it's simpler to acknowledge the morphology of an area. Location, and this is not very common, these things here, and you have to pay attention to this concept, to the key interpretation, to this interpretation key. The location indicates both the geographical location of an object and the position of an element with respect to others, and this is the second phase that is quite important. Some authors actually distinguish the two concepts and indicate the geographic position by location and by association the relative location of an object. The environment in which an object is inserted certainly helps to identify it. This is particularly true for natural elements and for anthropic elements, those related to agriculture, meaning the environment has morphology, altitude, exposure, climate. In order to make you clear this concept, for example, if we are defining the concept of location, the concept of location is very simple for us. And so we can measure, as you all know, for example, in our software with the cursor location value. So we can have the absolute position inside the matrix with the I, J indexes of the image matrix, or using the X, Y, so the eastern or northing for the geographic location, for the cartographic location, or for phi and lambda for angles for the geographic location. So, this concept is quite important for us, because just communicating the location of a particular object, we can give an information where this object is placed. But the association is something that is neglected usually, but is very important. For example, when we find a particular objects, for example on a coastline, we can understand that maybe these things could be an harbor, a port. So if there's a port, and this is the contrary of this assumption, if there's a port, an harbor, that means there should be water, of course. Another example, if we have a road, this road should go to somewhere. Otherwise, that makes no sense to have a road. So if there's a road, maybe along this road there will be some buildings, or this road goes to somewhere. Otherwise, there are no roads that are going to nowhere. There are no roads that are finishing in the middle of nothing. So this concept of association is very important. For example, if there are crops, there should be water. Otherwise, it's not possible to grow crops without water. If there are ships, of course there's water. If there's a shadow that is projected over a mountains, there should be a cloud, for example. So I mean, this concept of association, it sometimes neglected, but is very important for us in order to extract information from the data, because sometimes it's not really easy, as we know in the labs, to extract an information over a particular object, but it's easier to extract all the other objects in which we are not interested, in order to leave on the image only what is difficult to extract for itself. So I mean, we can also work on complementary information. So we are extracting what we are not interested in order to leave on the image the data that possibly represent what is really difficult to extract for itself. Okay, this is the end of this quite small lecture. That was the lecture number 10, that was introducing the photo interpretation basics. So, after 1 hour precisely, I finish this lecture. So, take care, and as always, never give up. Bye bye.